Well, for 35 years, my next guest has devoted his heart and soul to Aboriginal affairs. But today, Tom Calma is retiring, at least officially. He's handing over his role as the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Social Justice Commissioner. Mid-February will mark the second anniversary of Prime Minister Kevin Rudd's apology to the stolen generation. But the work of closing the gap, a term we now all understand when it comes to Indigenous health and opportunity, continues, and that work remains difficult and intractable. Tom Calma joins me now in the breakfast studio. Tom, welcome to breakfast.
Good morning, Fran, and good morning, listeners.
Tom, so much has happened since you took up the Commissioner's position in 2004. The ATSIC has been abolished. The Northern Territory intervention has occurred. The apology to the stolen generation I just mentioned. What's your assessment of Indigenous affairs in this country right now in 2010?
Right now, look, I think I always try to look at things from a positive perspective. I think we are starting to see the foundations being laid, to some hopeful future. Those foundations include, you mentioned, the Close the Gap on Indigenous health, which is a campaign that came out of my 2005 social justice report, and it's one that actually all governments of Australia are now starting to look at, including the federal government. They call it closing the gap at all areas of social and economic disadvantage. But there's still some way to go. But as I say, the foundations are there because we've got to look at it from a comprehensive plan. We've got to look at it from an opportunity to really look at needs-based funding. But the apology brought a big change in Australia and in relationships between Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people and mainstream Australia.
Well, let's just talk about this. So it's brought a big change. I mean, is it anything more than a symbolic gesture? Because if you look at all the indicators, there hasn't been big change, certainly since the apology anyway. Why would you expect there to be in just 2 years?
In 2 years, no. The big change has been, I think, in attitude, and we've seen a lot more people, I think the apology had, from my perspective, two significant impacts. One was on Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, and particularly those from the stolen generations, and it had a real cathartic effect for them to be able to get recognised that government policy had inflicted a great deal of pain on them, and it was previously not recognised. But the second, and more, as important, is the effect that it's had on the general population, because it's educated people to the situation of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, that there were policies of the past, and I suppose that's now been reinforced through the apology to the forgotten Australians, and all of a sudden people do realise that people were taken away and put into institutions.
I don't know if there's even much use asking you why are these problems so intractable. We talked about closing the gap. You're working on closing the gap, particularly in Indigenous health. Yep. It does seem intractable. We've had doctors and money put up there even since the Northern Territory intervention. Still the indicators in some areas are getting worse, not better.
Yeah.
Why is it so hard?
Well, look, I think there's a couple of answers to that as well. It is early times, and you'll see in the Close the Gap for Indigenous health that it's a 25-year strategy to the year 2030, and at least we're starting to look at a long-term time frame. And the good thing about the Close the Gap campaign is that we had in March 2008 both the government and the opposition sign up as a bipartisanship approach to a long-term plan, to a 25-year plan. So that's really setting the foundations, and they did that with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peak bodies and the health peak bodies. So we've got everybody in the same room, and we're all talking. All
talking, that's true, with respect. And I don't want to just keep harping on the failures, but the federal government also signed up to real numbers in terms of building Indigenous housing in remote Australia, and they're just not being built. I think the last thing I read, 6 have been built in 2 years.
Well, look, I haven't done the most recent analysis, but what I would say, and that I have publicly supported, is that the government is working with communities to try and ensure that they meet the 20% target of Indigenous employment on those housing projects and contracts.
And are they?
Well, I haven't, from what I understand from Jenny Macklin, yes, they're well progressed, the discussions, and contracts are starting to roll out, but it won't happen overnight. And that's the important thing to remember, is that, and this is a point that I raise with government all the time, is that it's fine to have the commitments to money, and we've seen, something like, over $4.6 billion in new monies come into Indigenous affairs. The rollout, the implementation of programs has to happen with the real participation of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples if we are going to see success. And so getting the foundations laid is going to be very important.
One of those foundations that you've laid, or I think you believe is one of the foundations, is the new National Indigenous Representative Body that's been formed in the last year after ATSIC was abolished. The same year you became Commissioner. You led the steering committee for this new Indigenous body, the National Congress of Australia's First Peoples. Will it be able to? What will it achieve?
Well, it's the first thing to recognise is that existing Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander bodies will still perform the functions that they're doing. Hopefully over time they'll develop. But the National Congress is an opportunity to be able to get people together to start to look at national priorities, to be able to provide advice to government. But more importantly, through the networks that we'll establish, they'll be able to assess and then provide quality advice through the Congress back to government about how policies and programs are being developed and implemented, how effective they are.
But government can choose to listen or not. This body will not be in control of an amount of money, for instance, will it?
No, and that was a very conscious effort on our part to say we didn't want to do it because we had a situation with ATSIC where they were often blamed for health outcomes and education outcomes, and they had no responsibility for either of those two major policy areas. They were government responsibilities. So the position we've taken is to say that governments, federal and state and territory, have a responsibility to deliver citizenship rights to all Australians, including Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. And what we're going to do is to monitor that delivery and make sure that we provide the advice back. But nobody can overrule the sovereignty of Parliament, and that's a really important thing to recognise. You see all the time that government sets up their own Senate and House of Reps committees. They don't even take notice of their recommendations. And so nobody has that right or capacity to overrule whether you're a black or a white organisation.